Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind. What the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. Growing up, you probably heard oversimplified anti-drug messages like, just say no, users are losers, or be smart, don't start. In all of these messages, any illegal drug was treated the same way, as dangerous, toxic, and sure to lead you down a terrible path in life. Finally, scientists and lawmakers are beginning to understand what some people have known all along, that not all drugs are the same. In the case of psychedelic drugs like LSD, magic mushrooms, and the South American brew ayahuasca, they can even have genuine positive effects in helping people fight depression and break bad habits. With these big changes happening in our attitudes towards certain drugs, author Michael Pollan decided to find out for himself what all the fuss was about. As you'll hear in the blinks ahead, Pollan had some revelatory experiences with psychedelic drugs, and he's ready to tell you all about it. Blink number 1. Our perception of psychedelic drugs has changed as people understand that not all drugs are dangerous. In 2006, the U.S. Supreme Court made an important decision when it ruled in favor of a small religious sect known as UDV, short for União de Vegetal. The ruling allowed the group to import ayahuasca, a special tea-like brew that comes from South America and contains strong hallucinogenic properties. While some of the individual substances in ayahuasca are federally banned, the sect was given the legal right to import and use the brew as part of its sacred and traditional rituals. We can now see this decision as part of a larger cultural shift in the United States' attitude toward drugs. The scientific perception of psychedelic drugs has also changed significantly, thanks in part to the neuroscientist Roland Griffiths, who is based out of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. In the summer of 2006, Griffiths published an eye-opening article that said psychedelic drugs could provide meaningful, mystical experiences that contribute to both spiritual and personal development. Griffiths' study was the first scientifically rigorous and placebo-controlled experiment to be conducted in the field since the 1960s. Griffith focused primarily on psilocybin, the substance found in hallucinogenic mushrooms, and its beneficial effects on the human psyche. Remarkably, the study received a warm reception by the press and was even endorsed by researchers like Herbert D. Klaber, who helped form the anti-drug policies of the first Bush administration. Klaber praised the study as promising and admired how thorough it had been. This marked quite a dramatic shift in popular opinion. After all, psychedelic drugs had been considered dangerous and illegal since the late 1960s, even though this attitude was largely due to a relatively small amount of bad experiences people had after taking the drugs in uncontrolled environments. But thanks in part to Griffith's published study, the public was starting to understand that there may be some drugs that aren't necessarily dangerous or toxic. Griffith helped make a distinction between two types of drugs: the more widespread hard drugs such as cocaine and heroin, which are highly toxic and addictive, and the traditional psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline. If taken correctly, these drugs are not only safe, but they can also be psychologically and spiritually beneficial. In the blinks ahead, we'll take a closer look at these psychedelics and how the author suggests they should be handled. Blink number 2. Psychedelic substances can be found organically in nature, but it takes a specialist to identify them. With all the attention given to the negative aspects of psychedelic drugs, like criminality and shady drug dealers, it's easy to forget the origins of psychedelics. While certain cultures have known about them for quite some time, it wasn't until the 1950s that Westerners discovered that psychedelic substances are a natural part of certain mushrooms. The first discovery was made in southern Mexico, when Western travelers were introduced to mushrooms containing psilocybin. Of course, the region's Mazatec Indian tribes had been using this psilocybin for centuries as both a healing agent and in their spiritual rituals. Soon afterward, in the late 1950s, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann was the first to artificially synthesize psilocybin in his laboratory. By the end of the 1960s, the war on drugs was gaining momentum, and these substances all became illegal in the United States. Police task forces were built to enforce the laws, and people were fed an image in which all drugs were dangerous and toxic. Everyone was to forget that psychedelics are organically found in nature and have been giving human beings, and presumably animals, mystical experiences for centuries. However, this doesn't mean anyone should go foraging for psychedelics. It takes a specialist to tell the difference between a good mushroom and a deadly one. One of the foremost authorities on identifying psychedelic mushrooms is the mycologist Paul Stamets, who points out that one wrongly identified mushroom can be a lethal mistake. In fact, the psilocybin mushrooms often grow right next to the Galerina autumnalis mushrooms, which look virtually identical but are extremely deadly. Stamets has published a field guide to help adventurous foragers identify psilocybin mushrooms in the wild. For starters, the mushroom must have gills underneath the head, and these gills should contain purple-black or brown spores. Most importantly, when bruised, the flesh of the mushroom will have a bluish hue. However, even with this knowledge, readers are strongly cautioned against trying to identify these mushrooms on their own. The risk of making a fatal mistake is high. Link number 3. Taking LSD is best done with a guide, and the experience is not necessarily what one expects. If you've taken a psychedelic drug once but didn't enjoy it, there's a good chance that your unpleasant experience was due to the environment. Things like loud music, alcohol, and unruly strangers can make the experience scary or even traumatic. But there are some simple precautions you can take to ensure that the drugs have a therapeutic effect and not a distressing one. If you're taking LSD, this is best done in a controlled and calm environment with an experienced guide. When the author, Michael Pollan, had his first LSD experience, his guide was Fritz, a German man who was part of a 3-day retreat that was designed to provide the best possible experience. On the first day, Fritz guided Pollan through a series of breathing exercises. On the second day, the actual LSD trip took place, and on the third day, they talked about the experience. A good guide will provide a safe and relaxing environment, as well as a reassuring presence in case anything goes wrong. It's also recommended that you do not take your first LSD trip with a close friend or partner, as you can easily start worrying about what the other person is experiencing instead of letting go of your worries and experiencing the therapeutic benefits. What Pollan also discovered is that an LSD experience is not necessarily what you'd expect. Pollan's mystical experience began with the first day's breath work. Fritz encouraged the author to breathe deep and fast while giving special effort to the exhale. After doing this for some time, Pollan found that his body began to continue breathing that way automatically. Amazingly, the author then had a vision of himself riding a horse, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly and fully connected to his body. When the session was over, he'd been breathing intensely for over an hour, and he felt absolutely radiant. As for the LSD experience, it wasn't some crazy trip. Instead, Pollan felt like he was being guided through a psychological exploration of his family. During his trip, he witnessed images from his son's life and then his father's life. By the time it was over, he'd developed a new sense of compassion and love for them both.